There are moments when no one has to say a word, and you can still hear the contempt hiding behind every glance. In America, it can happen anywhere, at a bank counter, inside a luxury store, or the moment you step into your own car. Not because you're dressed poorly, not because you lack success, but because your skin color has already written a story in their minds, and they've decided they have the right to believe it. Marcus Reed knows those looks all too well. As a black man running a multi-billion-dollar empire, he understands that real power isn't in how loud you shout to prove who you are. It's in how quietly you let others reveal who they are. But today, in the light drizzle of a Chicago afternoon, he's about to turn one moment of condescension into a lesson his opponent will never forget. A white man in a tailored suit rushes out of a building lobby, doesn't even glance up, opens the door to Marcus's black Cadillac Escalade, and tosses a leather briefcase into the back seat. "O'Hare, and make it quick, I'm late." His tone is sharp, the kind used for an Uber black driver, not for the CEO who just signed the deal to acquire his company. Marcus simply replies, "Yes, sir." No correction, no protest. Just the soft roll of the tires beneath the patter of rain on the roof. A silent game has just begun. In 20 minutes, that man will wish he'd looked more carefully into the rearview mirror. If you've ever been underestimated or misjudged because of how you look, hit that like button, share this video so more people can see, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story where the tables turn. Because today's story starts with a ride that seemed ordinary and ends with a change to a seat of power. And it begins right here. That afternoon, Chicago was wrapped in a thin layer of rain, like a veil. Soft enough to blur the edges of the city, cold enough to make people pull their collars tight. Streetlights spilled gold across the slick pavement, their reflections breaking apart as passing cars sliced through them. The smell of coffee from a corner cafe drifted into the damp air, slipping through the cracked windows of cars idling at the red light. The city looked like a painting, beautiful, cold, and never truly inviting. Marcus Reed sat behind the wheel of his black Cadillac Escalade, fresh out of the detailing shop that morning. He wore a charcoal suit, tie knotted neatly, his fingers tapping the steering wheel in time with the low jazz playing from the speakers. He wasn't in a rush. This was a big day, one planned down to the smallest detail for weeks. Up ahead was the grand entrance of the tallest tower in the financial district. Inside, a closed-door meeting awaited him, where the final signatures would end one era and start another. Marcus knew that once he walked through those doors, the top seat at Wellington Pierce would be his. But before he could even step out of the car, it happened. A figure emerged from the revolving door, moving quickly, a tall man in a perfectly cut navy suit. He adjusted his cuff as he clutched a phone between his shoulder and ear, his voice clipped and urgent. When he spotted Marcus's Escalade, he didn't pause for even a second. The rear door swung open. A leather briefcase landed on the seat, and the first words out of his mouth weren't a greeting. "O'Hare, step on it, I'm late." The tone was as dry and sharp as a general giving orders, coming from none other than Daniel Cross, the current CEO of a subsidiary in the system, a man about to lose his position without even knowing it. Daniel never looked at Marcus's face. In his mind, the driver's seat of a luxury SUV could only belong to one type of man. Marcus adjusted the rearview mirror slightly. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Just enough for Marcus to understand the entire story Daniel had already written in his head. Not the truth, but the version he assigned to any black man behind the wheel of a high-end car. Marcus said nothing but two words. "Yes, sir." Soft, almost smiling. The engine hummed. The tires rolled onto the wet street, pulling the glow of the streetlights along in stretched ribbons. He knew he'd just stepped into a chess game the man in the back didn't even know had begun. Because sometimes the rides that seem meaningless are the opening moves to a reversal big enough to change everything. And in just a few minutes, Daniel Cross would wish he'd looked a little harder in the rearview mirror. Daniel didn't ask the driver's name, didn't glance at the plates. In a city like Chicago, that was careless, bordering on arrogant, but for him, it came as naturally as breathing. He lived in a world where everything bent to his schedule, and Other people existed to keep it that way. He slid into the back seat, leaning slightly to one side to protect the sharp lines of his expensive suit. The phone still wedged between his shoulder and ear, his voice carried that same clipped command, "O'Hare, quick, I'm late." It sounded less like a request to a person and more like an order to a servant. Marcus kept his breathing steady. No reaction, no correction. "Yes, sir." The words left his mouth like a faint breeze, no ripple of emotion. But behind them was a silence measured with precision, a silence designed to make the man in the back feel it, to make him reveal more than he intended. Marcus turned the key. The Escalade's engine came to life with a deep, steady rumble, its growl swallowed by the soft percussion of rain on the windshield. The SUV slipped into the slow-moving current of traffic, gliding past wet streets lit by fractured light. In the mirror, Daniel was still locked into his call, eyes flicking over the phone screen, fingers tapping restlessly. But Marcus wasn't watching the phone. He was studying Daniel's face. The eyes that never strayed toward the front, the faint lift at the corner of his mouth, as if he were riding in a throne on wheels. Marcus's smile was almost imperceptible, a private signal to himself. It was the smile of a man holding the ace of spades, waiting for the perfect moment to play it. Outside, the rain smeared the city lights into streaks of gold and white. Inside, the air was still but tight, like a string pulled taut, just waiting for the first note to be plucked. Marcus knew he wouldn't be the one to break the silence. Not yet. For the game to be worth playing, the opponent had to step deeper into it, convinced he was in control, unaware he was walking straight into a trap. And with Daniel Cross, that first step had just been taken. Only a few more moves, Marcus thought, before the man in the back realized he was never the one driving. In the wide cabin, the contrast between the two men was as sharp as colors that could never blend. In the back seat, Daniel Cross sat angled to the side, one leg crossed neatly over the other. His polished leather shoes caught the dim streetlight, his navy suit molded perfectly to his frame, cufflinks glinting, a heavy metal watch clamped around his wrist. He scrolled through emails, brow furrowing now and then, letting out the occasional dry chuckle at a report. Not once did his eyes drift toward the man steering the vehicle. Up front, Marcus sat tall, hands steady on the wheel. His dark suit wasn't flashy, but the fit was exact, pressed so cleanly it held no wrinkles. His eyes stayed on the road, but the faint curve at the corner of his mouth remained. It wasn't the posture of a man taking orders. It was the posture of someone who knew exactly where he was going and exactly how he'd get there. Rain tapped steadily against the glass, the tires slicing through wet pavement with the slow rip of paper. Every so often, a gust of wind slipped through the vents, carrying the mingled scents of fuel, damp metal, and a faint trace of cigarette smoke from the car ahead. To an outsider, it was just another ride through the city, but inside, every second ticked like the clock in a courtroom, slow, tense, and unforgiving. Daniel stayed absorbed in his phone, believing the world was at his fingertips. He didn't realize the real world around him was shifting, and that the power he thought he owned had slipped from his grasp long ago. Marcus glanced at the rearview mirror, not long enough to be noticed, but long enough to catch the details. The way Daniel jabbed the screen to send a reply, the tilt of his chin when he liked what he read, and the complete absence of acknowledgement for the man driving him. The silence wasn't empty. It was like a thin sheet of ice on a lake. Calm until the wrong step shatters it all. And Marcus knew that wrong step was coming. Because the moment Daniel realized this wasn't the ride he thought it was, would be the moment everything changed. Daniel's phone was still pressed to his ear, his voice steady and full of confidence. At times, it carried the clipped authority of an order. At others, a soft chuckle like he'd just won an easy hand of cards. In the brief pauses between business talk, he let slip little remarks, not aimed at anyone in particular, but sharp enough to cut. Nowadays, anyone can drive a luxury car. Even. He let the rest trail off, stretching the silence as if the ending were too obvious to bother saying. The words slipped out lightly, but they landed heavy, like a stone breaking the surface of a still pond. He didn't have to finish the sentence. The picture in his head was already complete. A world where fine cars no longer meant status, and the people behind the wheel, especially those with skin like Marcus's, had merely stumbled into such luxury by accident. Marcus didn't respond, not because he hadn't heard, but because he refused to give Daniel the gift of a reaction. In his silence, Daniel only grew more certain of his imagined superiority. The Cadillac glided through an intersection, the red light spilling across the interior, painting half of Marcus's face in a thin wash of crimson. His eyes stayed forward, hands steady on the wheel, as if nothing had been said worth shifting his focus. Marcus knew that a rebuttal now would only become part of a story Daniel would later tell over dinner. A story about an overly sensitive driver. And Marcus had no intention of playing a role in that version. Instead, he let the gaps between Daniel's words swell, letting each comment fall into the silence and echo back without a single counterpoint. It was an art, getting someone to reveal themselves not through your words but through their own. Outside, the rain fell heavier, its drumming on the windshield relentless. Inside, Daniel kept talking, now about the decline in service, and how people these days don't know how to serve the upper class. Marcus's posture didn't change. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, an act that could be mistaken for checking the road, but in truth, he was filing away every smug expression for later. He knew these lines would be worth far more if saved for the right moment. A card played too soon was a card wasted. And Marcus never wasted his cards. Just a few more lines, he thought, and Daniel would have placed himself in a position he couldn't step out of. Daniel ended his call, slipped the phone into his jacket pocket, and pulled a small leather tube from his briefcase. He opened it and drew out a thick, dark cigar. The rich scent of tobacco quickly filled the cabin. Without asking, without so much as a glance, he leaned forward slightly and issued another command. "Open this window. I need some air." Marcus didn't turn around. He simply reached for the switch, lowering the rear passenger window. A gust of cold wind rushed in, carrying fine droplets of rain that speckled the leather seat. Daniel didn't notice. He struck a match, lit the cigar, and took a slow, indulgent drag, eyes half closed as he savored the expensive aroma mixing with his own self-satisfaction. The Cadillac rolled through another intersection and onto a narrow street lined with aging office buildings. Rainwater poured from rooftops, streaming into the gutters before splashing upward as the tires cut through. Marcus knew this stretch well, knew the bend ahead where the wind funneled rain into sharp, sudden bursts. Right on cue, as the SUV curved, a crosswind slapped a sheet of rain straight through the open window. The cold water splashed across Daniel's hand, slicing through the haze of cigar smoke. The flame sputtered and died, leaving the cigar damp, its wrapper stained in uneven, dark patches. Daniel jerked upright, caught between surprise and irritation. "Hey!" Marcus glanced into the rearview mirror, his face perfectly calm. "Oh, sorry, sir." His tone was light, polite enough to leave no opening for blame, yet carrying the faintest undertone of irony, so subtle it could be missed if you weren't listening for it. Daniel dabbed the cigar with a napkin, muttering under his breath about this damn weather and drivers who don't pay attention. He didn't know that Marcus paid more attention than anyone he'd ever met, just not in the way Daniel assumed. Marcus returned to his usual posture, eyes forward, but in his mind, a piece had been placed firmly on the board. Sometimes to chip away at someone's arrogance, you don't need to strike with words. You just let nature and a little well-timed weather do the work. Outside, the sky stayed gray, raindrops sliding down the glass like unfinished sentences. Inside, the silence returned. Not the same as before, but heavier, thicker, as if something had just been marked. Marcus knew he'd only knocked once on the gate of this fortress of ego, and soon he'd push it wide open. Because the second knock would leave the man inside with nowhere to retreat. Daniel folded the napkin, set the extinguished cigar aside as though trying to bury the moment beneath the leather seat. He leaned back, exhaled sharply, then pulled out his phone again. The screen lit up, and his voice fell back into its familiar cadence, fast, clipped, unwilling to let anyone else speak. His words weren't for Marcus, but the tone carried the same weight. He complained to someone about a miscalculated report, scolded an employee for not knowing the proper way to address their superiors, and tossed in vague remarks about people these days. Every sentence was dusted with a thin layer of disdain, like salt sprinkled over a dish already heavy with the flavor of power. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed forward, but the mirror gave him everything. Every crease in Daniel's brow, every purse of his lips. It wasn't just the habit of a skilled driver. It was the practice of a man trained to read an opponent when they thought they were talking to empty air. Every line Daniel spoke, Marcus stored away, arranging them like chess pieces. Not for an immediate strike, but for the moment when one move could topple the entire game. Patience was a craft Marcus had perfected, knowing when to speak, when to hold back, and most importantly, the value of letting someone paint their own portrait in the ugliest colors. The SUV turned onto a new street, the sweep of a streetlight cutting across the cabin and catching the deeper lines in Daniel's forehead. The lines of a man busy, but more so, a man used to being on top. Daniel didn't know that in just a few hours, that very comfort at the top would be the reason he'd lose it all. Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel, not from tension, but as a reminder to keep the pace steady. Everything was moving exactly as it should. No need to push. Just let Daniel keep talking, keep believing he was in control. Because a man only truly panics when he realizes he never had control to begin with. Outside, the rain was easing, but streaks of water still crawled down the glass, reflecting the image of a man in the back seat, convinced of his own story. And in the front seat sat another man, quietly keeping that story intact, waiting for the moment to turn it inside out. Because when this car stopped in a place Daniel never expected, the silence would no longer be on his side. They had barely turned off the main street when Daniel looked up from his phone and tapped the back of the driver's seat, the way a man might summon a longtime servant. "Stop at the VIP lot up ahead. I need to grab something from a friend," he said, his tone assuming the request couldn't possibly be refused. Marcus didn't look back. He simply turned the wheel, guiding the Escalade down a smooth, stone-paved drive into the underground garage of an upscale office complex. This was the kind of parking reserved for people whose names were already on the list, the kind who never had to wait for a gate to open. The barrier lifted automatically, the sensor catching the license plate. Harsh white fluorescent light bounced off the hood, as though the Cadillac were sliding through a giant mirror. At the bottom of the ramp, a young security guard stood at his post, shirt fitted neatly across a solid frame, radio in hand. As the SUV rolled closer, he lifted his head, and in an instant, the sternness on his face melted into a look of recognition. "Good afternoon, boss," he said, with a mix of respect and ease that spoke of familiarity. Daniel's head tilted slightly, his brows lifting for just a fraction of a second. He glanced toward the windshield, then away again. No questions. In his mind, perhaps boss was just a polite throwaway term a guard might use for anyone driving a high-end car. But Marcus knew better. The guard wasn't just recognizing the vehicle. His eyes had gone straight to Marcus, never once drifting toward the man in the back seat. And the way his voice dropped when he said, "boss," the way his smile curved, those were the cues of someone who knew exactly who he was addressing. Marcus gave a brief nod in return, courteous but not overly warm. Sometimes to keep the game in play, you don't reveal more than necessary, especially when the passenger behind you still believes he's the center of the story. Daniel had already gone back to his phone, typing out short bursts of text. He didn't realize that moment, a simple greeting, was the first crack in the tidy picture he'd built in his head about the man behind the wheel. The VIP lot was quiet, filled only with the low hum of ventilation fans and the steady tap of the guard's footsteps fading into the distance. Marcus eased the SUV into a space, the engine idling, light glancing off the rear window where Daniel sat, without a flicker of suspicion. But the day would come when Daniel would remember that "good afternoon, boss," and realize it had never been meant for him. Daniel looked up again as the sound of the guard's steps receded, He smirked, the corners of his mouth pulling into something halfway between amusement and condescension. "Huh," he said with a soft, dismissive laugh. "Even drivers get called boss now?" The words left his mouth lightly, almost offhand, but the edge in them was sharp enough to test for a reaction. It was like a quick, clean prick from a needle, just enough to draw a flinch if there was one. Marcus didn't turn. His eyes stayed forward, left hand adjusting the gear shift, right hand resting steady on the wheel. Only the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth betrayed anything. A small, private smile you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. He didn't answer. Not because the question was difficult, but because it wasn't worth answering. Some remarks grow larger when challenged. Left in silence, they shrink and echo back to their source. The hum of the fans mixed with the low, even purr of the engine. Above, the fluorescent lights washed over the curve of the hood like a stage light between acts. To Marcus, the scene already felt like a set change. The real lead of the next act would not be Daniel. Daniel lingered for a moment, perhaps expecting a reply. When none came, he went back to his phone, his fingers moving faster now, as though proving to himself he didn't care about the silence. But Marcus's silence wasn't empty. It was a held note suspended in the air, waiting for the perfect chord to follow. A quick glance in the rearview wasn't to check on Daniel, but to measure the space between them, the literal space and the gulf of perception. One man still thought he was speaking to a service worker. The other knew he was staring at the perfect chance to set another piece in place. Daniel exhaled, the sound meant to close the moment, to underline his own authority. But to Marcus, it was an unguarded confirmation. Daniel still hadn't realized he was being watched and remembered, detail by detail. And when he did realize, those details would read like a case file he couldn't escape. The guard's "good afternoon, boss" still seemed to hang in the air, a simple phrase lodged in memory like a tune you didn't ask to hear but couldn't stop humming. To a casual observer, it was just politeness. But anyone listening closely would have caught the difference. The dip in tone, the easy familiarity, the absence of any forced formality. This wasn't how a guard greeted just anyone stepping out of a luxury vehicle. This was how a subordinate spoke to the person who signed his checks. If Daniel had been paying attention, he might have asked a question. But he wasn't. Or maybe he was too certain of the script in his head to notice the piece that didn't fit. He let it slide by, filing it away as coincidence. Marcus saw it for what it was. Every word, every look had weight. This was the first score across the surface of the fortress Daniel believed he stood behind. Just one line, but enough to hint at what was coming. The garage was still, but for the low whir of the fans. Under the white lights, the Cadillac's shadow stretched across the concrete floor, split cleanly by a painted yellow line. Marcus sat with the engine running, his hands loose on the wheel, eyes fixed on the exit. He didn't have to turn around to know what Daniel was doing. The faint scrape of a fingertip over a screen, the soft vibration of an incoming message, they painted the whole picture. For the man in the back seat, this was just a brief stop, a pause before the next item on his agenda. For the man in the front, it was a measured prelude, another quiet sign that everything was moving exactly where he wanted it to go. This silence was different from all the others. Not an empty gap, but a dense, charged stillness, carrying the undercurrent of a change unspoken. It was like the scent of ozone before a storm. You couldn't see the sky turn, but you knew what was on its way. Marcus let it spread, untouched, unexplained. He understood that the biggest turns often start with the smallest details others overlook. And very soon, Daniel would understand that the greeting he'd dismissed as harmless had been the first warning of the moment he'd lose everything. As the SUV pulled out of the VIP lot and merged back onto the rain-slick street, Daniel glanced at his watch, then jerked his chin toward a corner ahead. "Stop at that cafe. Get me a hot latte. Make it quick," he said, as if it were an unquestionable part of whatever job Marcus was supposed to be doing. Marcus didn't answer. He just eased into the right lane. The place Daniel had picked wasn't some corner coffee shop. Floor-to-ceiling glass glowed warm from within, showing caramel leather chairs, a polished marble counter, and baristas in black uniforms with gold pins. Customers sat scattered around, men in suits, women in tailored dresses, each with an ultra-thin laptop. It was the kind of place where one latte cost as much as a lunch for an entire night shift crew. Marcus pulled to the curb, shut off the engine, and stepped out. Light drizzle speckled his polished black shoes. He pushed open the cafe door, letting the heat and the rich scent of roasted coffee wash over him. Inside the SUV, Daniel stayed put, leaning toward the window, watching pedestrians pass. His fingertips tapped lightly against his thigh. "Don't know where these drivers learn their trade, say quick and they vanish for 10 minutes, he muttered. Not loud, but with enough weight that anyone sitting nearby would recognize it for what it was. A complaint wrapped in polite paper. He caught sight of Marcus at the counter, standing straight, one hand in his pocket, eyes quietly scanning the room. The stance made Daniel frown slightly. It wasn't the posture of someone running an errand in a hurry. It was the posture of someone choosing his moment. The seconds ticked forward on Daniel's wristwatch. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slow, as if filing away one more reason to tell a story later about declining service standards. He had no idea those very complaints were becoming pieces Marcus would later rearrange into an entirely different picture, one where Daniel wouldn't be in the role he imagined. Outside, Marcus accepted the latte with both hands, letting the heat seep into his palms. He stepped back into the drizzle, eyes catching the dark SUV through the fogged glass. A faint curve touched his lips, like a man who'd just added another chess piece to the board, though no one yet knew its shape. And when Daniel took his first sip, he wouldn't just be tasting coffee. He'd be swallowing a compact lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Marcus returned at an unhurried, steady pace, every step carrying its own weight. Sliding into the driver's seat, he set the cup in the holder between them, the steam curling into the scent of the leather interior. Daniel glanced over, phone still in one hand, cup in the other. He didn't ask. He didn't think. He just twisted off the lid and drank. The first sip hit, and his brows knotted instantly. "No sugar?" His voice wasn't loud, but the edge in it turned the question into an accusation. Eyes still forward, Marcus started the engine. The low growl filled the cabin. "That's right," he said lightly, as if it were obvious. Daniel lowered the cup, looking at him with a blend of puzzlement and irritation. "I hate unsweetened lattes," he said, each word clipped, like delivering a basic lesson. Merging back into traffic, Marcus replied, "Maybe sometimes less sweet is better, sir." The tone was calm enough to avoid sounding like defiance, but sharp enough for anyone perceptive to hear the layer beneath. Daniel went silent for a beat, weighing whether to bite back. In the end, he just exhaled hard, set the cup down, and returned to his phone. To him, it was a minor exchange not worth his energy. To Marcus, it was a small scratch in Daniel's polished armor, one that would spread. In the rearview, Marcus caught Daniel glancing at the latte again, eyes flicking over the thin foam at the rim. It was a fleeting look, but enough to reveal the first threads of impatience weaving through. Outside, the rain continued to bead the pavement, each drop catching streetlight like a coin hitting the ground. Inside, the gap between the two men was closing, not in inches, but in the rhythm of small, deliberate touches. Each one nudged the boundary a little farther. Daniel didn't know that every detail, every seemingly trivial choice was deliberate. From the stubbed-out cigar to the sugarless latte, they were tests, warm-ups, each one feeding into the moment Marcus would deliver a single, decisive strike. And when that moment landed, Daniel would understand it had been building in plain sight. "Maybe sometimes less sweet is better, sir." Marcus had dropped the line like a comment about the weather. No raised voice, no obvious sarcasm. Just let it fall into the air where it could slip quietly into the listener's ear. And because it came so gently, it was like a drop of cold water down the back of the neck, subtle but enough to make Daniel's shoulders tighten. Daniel set the cup back in the holder, his eyes momentarily clouded. He didn't react right away. Partly because the words didn't seem worth debating, partly because he was still working out why they irritated him so much. The answer was in the subtext. It wasn't just about coffee. It had brushed against his pride. Marcus kept his posture steady, eyes locked on the glistening lanes ahead. The rain had eased, but the sky still hung with a dull gray curtain, turning the streetlights a muted yellow. In that light, the silence between them took on its own sound. In the back seat, Daniel leaned into the leather, fingers tapping an idle rhythm on his thigh, gaze drifting out the window. He tried to dismiss the remark, but like the aftertaste of a sugarless coffee, it lingered. Marcus's eyes flicked to the mirror, catching Daniel's reflection. Blurred, but enough for a brief meeting of gazes. He didn't hold it, but he didn't look away too quickly either. Just long enough for Daniel to know he was being watched. Then Marcus returned to the road, as if the comment had never meant anything beyond flavor. But Marcus knew the most effective blows didn't bruise on impact. They sank in, waiting. And when the right moment came, all the stored weight would land at once. The tires rolled smooth over shallow puddles, reflecting half-faded neon signs. Neither man spoke again, but the air had shifted. A quiet irritation was blooming, not enough to erupt, but enough to eat at the confidence Daniel wore like armor. Marcus knew he'd just turned another notch on the invisible lock. Each notch was a step closer to the moment the door would swing open, and the man inside would realize he'd been steered there all along. And very soon, Daniel would realize the bitterness wasn't just in the coffee. When the light turned green, Marcus should have taken a right toward the expressway that would carry them straight to O'Hare. Instead, he flicked the wheel left, guiding the Cadillac Escalade into a quiet side street, one known only to a few, leading directly into the financial district, where the Wellington Pierce headquarters rose like a steel monolith against the cold Chicago sky. In the back seat, Daniel Cross noticed nothing. He was too deep in a phone conversation, his voice low and deliberate, like a man reciting his own manifesto. Real power, he said, hitting each word, doesn't live on a business card. It lives in people doing what you tell them. No explanations, no persuasion. Marcus listened without interrupting, letting the words slide past like raindrops still rolling off the roof. He knew Daniel wasn't speaking to whoever was on the other end. He was speaking to himself, shoring up the pride-built walls he'd leaned on for years. The street narrowed, flanked by tall glass buildings reflecting streaks of gold and blue from glowing signs. The SUV glided under a line of streetlights, beams slicing across Marcus's face, highlighting his complete focus. Not rushed, not slow. Every turn as smooth as if rehearsed. Daniel went on. I've met all kinds who think they're powerful, but in front of me they all step back. Not because I yell, but because they know who I am. Marcus's mouth curved, almost a smile. For a fraction of a second, his eyes left the road to catch Daniel's reflection in the rear view. Lounging back, half-lidded eyes, clearly impressed with the sound of his own voice. At the end of the block, the glass tower of Wellington Pierce began to appear, its facade catching the pale light of the overcast sky. With every yard closer, Marcus felt himself nearing the meeting point. Not just on a map, but in a game that had been played out in his mind for a long time. Daniel didn't notice, and Marcus gave him no reason to suspect. This route was a few minutes longer than the airport exit, but that was exactly the time Marcus needed. To keep Daniel in the warm glow of his own confidence, right before pulling the curtain down. The SUV took the final turn, tires whispering against damp asphalt. In the rear view, Daniel was still talking about real power, oblivious to the fact that he was about to come face to face with it, in a form he wouldn't expect. And when the vehicle stopped, he would learn that power didn't sit in the seat he occupied, but in the hands holding the wheel. Daniel had just finished his sentence when Marcus, eyes still forward, said quietly, "You're about to find out." It wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp. Spoken in the even, steady tone of a throwaway remark, but with something in it that lingered longer than it should. Daniel tilted his head, frowning faintly as if to ask, but then dismissed it, assuming it was nothing more than idle chatter from the driver. The street widened, revealing the full height of Wellington Pierce. A blade of glass catching what little light there was, standing both a part of the city and apart from it. Marcus eased off the gas, letting the SUV roll smoothly over the pristine stone-paved approach. Up ahead, two uniformed security guards stood straight, their eyes locking on the driver instantly. They both bowed their heads, a short, respectful nod given only to someone they recognized as above them. Daniel's lips twitched upward. He assumed, of course, they were greeting him. Even from the back seat, he was used to people lowering their gaze for someone important. He didn't notice their eyes had never left Marcus. Marcus pulled up to the entrance. The automatic glass doors slid open, revealing a grand lobby, its marble floor glowing under soft amber light. From behind the reception desk, a young woman looked up, offering Marcus a discreet smile. Not the kind given to passing visitors, but the acknowledgement reserved for one of their own. Daniel saw it, and in his mind it was confirmation of his own stature. "What are we doing here?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and mild concern about his flight time. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He cut the engine, pocketed the key, then turned fully, meeting Daniel's gaze with a calm so deep it was unreadable. "You'll see," he said, before stepping out. The solid thud of the door closing broke the vague comfort that had been hanging in the cabin. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and smelling faintly of wet concrete. Marcus walked around to open the back door, a gesture of courtesy that only reinforced Daniel's belief that he was being treated as an honored guest. Straightening his tie, Daniel stepped out with the air of a man certain the room ahead would bend to him. He had no idea that in a few short paces, everything he believed was about to warp beyond recognition. That moment, it was just beyond the glass doors. His footsteps echoed on the marble, the sound merging with the soft hum of the vast lobby. The air carried the refined scent of wood, leather, and the faintest trace of expensive perfume. Golden light glinted on polished surfaces, giving the space the feel of a stage prepared for a major performance. Marcus walked half a step ahead. Not fast, not slow, steady as if this were his daily route. Daniel followed, eyes sweeping the surroundings, wearing the same look of self-assurance he carried into any grand setting. They passed the reception desk. The receptionist nodded at Marcus with the quiet acknowledgement of someone greeting a superior. Daniel caught it, and misreading entirely, filed it as yet another sign of his own importance. The elevator chimed, its doors parting. Marcus stepped aside, gesturing for Daniel to enter first. Inside, the small space made the silence sharper. Daniel adjusted his tie again, catching his own reflection in the mirrored steel, and said, half joking, half serious, "Not bad. Still don't see why we're here, though." Marcus didn't respond right away. He pressed the button for the 45th floor, the very top, before turning to glance at Daniel, his eyes scanning him like a man studying a map he already knew by heart. "You'll see soon enough," he said, his voice low and even, letting the words hang in the air between them. The floor numbers ticked upward, each chime like a small knock on the door of anticipation. Anyone paying attention could feel it. Something significant was drawing near. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a hallway lined with deep blue carpet, abstract paintings, and oversized glass panels. At the far end stood a pair of tall, dark wooden doors. Behind them lay something Daniel couldn't guess, but Marcus knew exactly. He slowed his pace so Daniel would walk beside him. It was only a few meters to those doors, but for anyone perceptive, it was the distance where assumptions start to crumble. And when those doors opened, Daniel would understand why this ride had never been about getting to the airport. Marcus placed his hand on the double doors, a firm but unhurried push, sending them gliding open on silent hinges, allowing light from within to spill into the hallway. He stepped slightly aside, an act that was at once polite and deliberate, gesturing for Daniel to enter first. Still convinced he was the central figure, Daniel strode across the threshold with the ease of a man accustomed to rooms of influence. But the instant he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Thicker, heavier than the air outside. The 45th floor boardroom was unlike most Daniel had seen. High ceilings, dark walnut-paneled walls, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city below, where lesser buildings seemed to bow beneath this tower's presence. At its center stretched a black granite table polished so sharply it reflected the lights above. Around it sat the full board of directors, faces Daniel knew well and others he'd only encountered in moments of high importance. No one stood. No one smiled. They simply looked up, their eyes fixed on the doorway, on Marcus, his frame still partly in the threshold, as though he was controlling the very breathing of the room. Daniel hesitated for half a second, perhaps thrown by the stillness. He waited for an invitation to sit, or even a casual greeting, but none came. The only sounds were the tick of the wall clock and the faint whine of wind against the glass. Marcus stepped in, closing the doors behind him. The soft click was final. It was now a sealed space. No one in, no one out. Not until it was over. He advanced toward the table, his steps slow and solid, each one like the measured beat of a distant drum. Daniel's gaze drifted, searching for context, for a clue. But instead of eyes turned toward him, most were trained on Marcus. Not as if on a driver, but on someone they had been waiting for. Marcus reached the head of the table and rested his hand on the back of the chair. He didn't sit, just stood there, stretching the moment. No one in the room moved. This wasn't empty silence. It was engineered, built from respect and authority. Daniel hadn't yet grasped it, but anyone perceptive could tell. This was no ordinary boardroom, and Marcus's role here was nothing like what Daniel imagined. Because once Marcus sat, every other seat would have to reassess its position. Marcus set the car key down on the granite, the soft clink echoing in the still air. He unbuttoned his jacket, folded it neatly, and laid it on the chair beside him. No wasted movement. No rush. Every gesture claiming the space as his. Then he sat. In the chair of the presiding officer, the seat Daniel, in his mind, reserved for the highest ranks, now occupied by the man he still believed had been his uber-black driver. Daniel froze, his hand tightening around the handle of his briefcase. His eyes scanned the room, searching for an explanation, but no one met him with the look he wanted. A few board members gave Marcus small nods, as if confirming a decision long made. "Sorry, is there some mistake here?" Daniel asked, trying to lace the question with lightness to mask the irritation rising in him. No one replied. Not even Marcus, who simply sat upright, eyes fixed on Daniel, calm as if watching a chess match where his next move had already been decided. The first cracks appeared in Daniel's composure. A blink that came too quickly, a slightly deeper breath, his hand moving to fasten his jacket button, the reflex of a man trying to reclaim the initiative. But the board had already turned. Daniel just hadn't seen it. Marcus opened the notebook before him, flipped a few pages, and set his pen down as though preparing to lead the meeting. He didn't speak. It was the silence that unseated Daniel, pressing the weight of every eye in the room onto him. Daniel forced a polite smile and glanced at the member to his left. "I wasn't informed about this meeting." The man offered only a neutral, almost empty look before turning back to Marcus. Daniel's pulse ticked up. Something was off, but he clung to his assumption. He was still the one in control. Marcus set his pen down, fingers interlacing, gaze locked on Daniel. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't mocking, it was certain. And that certainty was more unsettling than any threat. Because Daniel didn't yet understand he was in a room where his seat had never really been his anymore. Marcus let the silence stretch a few beats longer, like a conductor holding the pause before the downstroke. Then he looked up, voice low, clear and steady. "I'm Marcus Reed, the new CEO of Wellington Pierce." No applause, no murmur. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, not splashing loudly, but shifting everything beneath the surface. Daniel blinked as if mishearing. His eyes darted for someone, anyone, to mirror his disbelief, but every face remained set, fixed on Marcus. What's that supposed to mean?" Daniel asked, a thin, awkward laugh breaking at the edges. He wanted to believe it was a joke. Marcus didn't answer right away. He sat straighter, hands still clasped, eyes unblinking. The look alone held Daniel's next words hostage. One of the board members, seated near the far end, slid a folder toward Daniel. "Appointment resolution," he said plainly. Daniel looked down. The bold print on the first page left no room for misinterpretation. The board of directors hereby appoints Marcus Reed as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Daniel lifted his head, lips moving without sound. For several seconds, the only noise was the clock and the distant patter of rain against the glass. This silence was no void, it was dense, pressing the air from his lungs. Marcus remained still. No smile, no gloating, just letting the truth take root. His control of the room came not from noise, but from forcing everyone to move to his rhythm. Daniel blinked again, slower this time, as though adjusting to a light that no longer shone on him. Marcus tilted his head slightly, closing the introduction. "We have a lot to discuss," he said, his tone even but unmistakable in authority. And that was when Daniel understood. His chair had changed hands right in front of him, and he never saw the move coming. A board member, his silver hair neatly combed and his voice measured like a man reciting an oath, opened the thick folder in front of him. He didn't look at Daniel. He didn't look at Marcus. His eyes stayed fixed on the words printed clearly on the page. Based on the consecutive quarterly losses over the past 3 quarters and the findings of our internal investigation regarding a workplace environment marked by disrespect and discriminatory conduct, the board of directors, in unanimous agreement, has decided to terminate the employment contract of Mr. Daniel Cross, effective immediately. No murmurs, no clearing of throats. It was delivered like a verdict long settled, simply waiting for the moment to be read aloud. Daniel sat frozen. His eyes blinked rapidly, then stopped altogether. His mouth parted slightly, but no sound came. Every familiar phrase, every rebuttal, denial, or justification vanished from his mind the instant he heard the words effective immediately. Several board members lowered their pens to sign the resolution, the scratch of ink against paper sounding like chisels against stone. Each signature was a period, quiet but final. Marcus remained still at the head of the table, hands loosely interlaced. This was not his moment to speak. It was Daniel's moment to confront the emptiness that had just opened beneath him. Marcus's presence in the presiding chair was statement enough. Daniel swallowed hard. The room seemed to shrink, and the distance to the door stretched into something endless. He looked down at his own hands, knuckles pale from gripping the handle of his briefcase. Only minutes ago he believed he was on his way to the airport for an important business trip. Now the destination had completely changed. No one in the room looked smug. No one jeered. But the calm itself was the sharpest cut, a silent consensus that his time was over. Marcus kept his gaze on Daniel, steady, patient, unhurried. That look was like a mirror forcing Daniel to see himself in the moment he lost everything, not through a heated argument or a public scene, but through a series of silent moves set in motion long before. Daniel drew in a deep breath, only for it to leave him in a faint tremor. Not from the cold, but because for the first time in years he realized he had nothing left to say. And in a room full of power, silence is the bitterest admission of all. The air remained thick as Marcus rose slowly to his feet. He made no gesture to anyone, no commentary on what had just transpired. Instead, he pulled out his phone, tapped a few familiar motions, and set it on the table as the screen lit up with the words, "Your Uber Black is on the way." No one asked questions. A few board members exchanged brief glances as if the meaning was already understood. Daniel stayed still, thinking Marcus's action was nothing more than a practical arrangement after the meeting. He didn't yet see it for what it was, a final exclamation point on the morning's events. Marcus picked up the phone, checked the estimated arrival, 4 minutes. He gave a small nod, then walked the length of the table, stopping beside Daniel's chair. "Your car will be here shortly," Marcus said, his voice even and light, like an airline announcement of a departure time. Daniel blinked. "Car?" He didn't have the chance to finish before Marcus tilted his head slightly toward the door. The gesture was so polite it could not be challenged, yet it made Daniel feel like a guest being shown out, not a colleague being kept in. They left together. Daniel's footsteps echoed down the hallway, lacking the certainty they had when he arrived. The elevator descended to the ground floor faster than he expected, and when the doors opened, the familiar black Cadillac Escalade was gone. In its place sat another black sedan, sleek, spotless, and bearing an Uber logo on its windshield. A man in a dark jacket stepped out from the driver's seat, holding a name placard, smiling. "Mr. Cross?" Daniel paused for a beat. The question landed like a warped echo of the previous afternoon, when he had stepped into a black vehicle and assumed the man behind the wheel was his driver. This time, no one was mistaken. No one diminished him. The question was simply protocol. But that simplicity was enough to make him feel as though he had come full circle, back to the place where he had once placed someone else. Marcus stood a few steps away, one hand in his pocket, his expression calm. No smile, no triumphant nod. Just letting Daniel walk toward the car, slow, as if gathering what was left of a position now gone. The driver opened the rear door, gesturing for Daniel to enter. As the door closed, their eyes met briefly through the glass. In Marcus's gaze, Daniel saw a quiet that wasn't the quiet of victory, but the quiet of someone who had placed everything exactly where it belonged. And in that moment, Daniel realized he had never been the one driving this ride. The sedan pulled away from Wellington Pierce's entrance, its tires gliding over rain-slick brick. Daniel sat in the back, leaning into the seat, eyes on the misted window. The city slid by in blocks, neon signs blurring into reflections on wet asphalt. He still said nothing. At this point, any defense or effort to save face was meaningless. Outside, the streets he'd walked so confidently now felt foreign, like the very world of influence he once stood in had turned its back. Through the rearview mirror, the driver asked gently, "O'Hare Airport, sir?" Daniel nodded but didn't speak. That voice, that courteous question, it pulled him straight back to the defining moment hours earlier, and to the story he once thought he was scripting. He looked at his hands resting on his lap. Still the same hands, still wearing the expensive watch, but now unable to open any door. The nod from the receptionist, the security guard's salute, the instant return of his calls, all of it had left in a single breath. At a red light, Daniel caught his own reflection in the glass. It wasn't the face of a man betrayed, it was the face of a man who had authored his own downfall. It hadn't been an outside blow that ended him, it was the contempt, the certainty that he was above others that sealed his fate. He remembered that morning, stepping into the Cadillac, issuing orders without asking the driver's name. Remembered Marcus's "yes, sir," which he'd taken for obedience but was, in truth, the opening line of a game already in motion. And now he was here in a different car, heading to a different destination, the final ride of his career. The sedan passed through a stretch of road where light streaked like blades across the wet pavement. Daniel tilted his head, letting that light sweep across his face. Maybe even knowing the ending, he would have made the same mistake, because it was built into him. But this time, there would be no second chance. The light turned green. The car rolled on, smooth, as though it carried no one who had just lost everything. And in the backseat, Daniel understood. Some journeys don't take you where you want to go. They take you where you need to face yourself. A few weeks after that rainy morning, by the time Chicago had traded its gray winter coat for the light gold of spring, a cream-colored envelope appeared on Marcus's desk. No company logo, no return address. Just his name, written in a neat, deliberate hand in the center. Marcus turned it over in his fingers. He recognized the handwriting instantly. Tidy, careful, leaning slightly to the right, like the script of a man trying to keep steady while standing on the edge of something steep. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One page. But every sentence felt compressed by hours of deliberation. Daniel wrote that he had done a lot of thinking since the day he left Wellington Pierce. That he had realized the way he looked at others, especially black people, was always filtered through a distorted lens. That on the day he sat in a car he assumed was his, he didn't just lose a position. He lost a respect he had always assumed was his by default. The letter ended with an apology. No drama, no embellishment, Just a few short lines, perhaps because he knew any extra words would only dilute its weight. Marcus slid the letter back into the envelope, opened the right-hand drawer of his desk, and placed it at the very bottom. He didn't crumple it. He didn't toss it in the trash. But he didn't respond either. Because Marcus knew some apologies don't need to be accepted to have value. Their worth lies in what the person does afterward, and that Marcus didn't need to witness. He closed the drawer and let the quiet settle. Outside the window, the streets moved quickly under the spring sun. People rushing past with no idea a shift in power had unfolded in this city not long ago. Marcus turned back to the file on his desk. His next meeting would start in 10 minutes. There were still contracts to sign, decisions to make, choices that would affect hundreds of lives. The world doesn't stop to contemplate a lesson, but those who've lived through one carry its mark forever. And wherever Daniel Cross was now, he was surely learning how to live with that mark. Because sometimes the deepest lessons don't come from what we gain, but from what we are forced to lose. Marcus sat a moment longer after tucking the letter away. The desk lamp cast a warm light over the sharp edges of the neatly stacked files, but his mind circled around a simple truth. Not every story needs an answer. He'd learned that from his father, a quiet man who spoke rarely, but whenever he did, the room fell silent to listen. The best answer sometimes, his father once said, is silence. It gives the other person the space to hear themselves. Marcus smiled faintly at the memory. That day with Daniel hadn't been about revenge or a game of one-upmanship. It had been about holding up a mirror at the right moment, forcing a man to see himself. And sometimes, without another word, that mirror is bright enough. He stood, slipped on his coat, and stepped out of his office. The hallway was wide, the carpet soft, each footstep steady. As the glass doors opened, the scent of early spring rain swept in. Cool, clean, carrying the faint sense of washing something away. Outside, the drizzle fell in a slant under the streetlights, breaking into tiny bursts of light before hitting the ground. People hurried past under umbrellas and hoods, each fixed on their own destination, none looking back. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his chest. He knew that with every rain, the city washed something away. Sometimes dirt, sometimes a story. And the one between him and Daniel was best left to the rain. But in that stillness, he also understood. Rain doesn't just erase. It leaves traces, streaks on glass, pools on the pavement, and memories that refuse to fade. He pulled his collar closer and stepped down the stairs. His black Cadillac idled at the curb, the engine's hum as deep as a steady breath. Marcus opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. Tomorrow, he might drive it to another meeting, face new people, meet familiar gazes. And maybe somewhere out there, someone might again mistake him for the driver of their journey. But next time, would they be so sure they were the one choosing the destination? From down the street came the soft, warm growl of another engine. A sleek black sedan rolled toward the entrance, its headlights washing gold across the wet pavement. In the windshield, a small digital sign glowed with familiar words. Uber Black. Marcus stood under the awning, one hand in his coat pocket, watching it approach. The sight carried him back to that cold, wet morning weeks ago, when a man strode out of a building without a glance, opened his car door, and issued orders as if the world existed to serve him. But today was different. Today, no one gave orders. The car stopped. The driver, a young woman with a warm smile, rolled down the window. "Mr. Reed?" she asked, her voice gentle but assured. Marcus nodded. "That's right, thank you for coming." He stepped forward, hand resting lightly on the door handle, and slid into the back seat. A simple act, but layered with meaning. This time, he chose where to sit. He chose how to enter the story. The rear seat was soft, the faint scent of leather mingling with the warmth of coffee from the cup in the holder. Marcus looked out the window, the city passing in blurred streaks of light through the rain. No rush, no tension. Just a short ride, enough to remind himself what it means to let someone else take the wheel, yet still know exactly where you're headed. The driver asked where he'd like to go. Marcus smiled and gave her an address. His voice was calm, but his eyes narrowed just slightly, as though the answer wasn't just for her. It was for the echoes still lingering from that cold morning. The tires rolled smoothly, turning onto familiar streets. Marcus leaned back, letting the quiet settle. He knew there would always be more Daniel crosses, people stepping into a journey unaware of its true destination. And he knew the sharpest lessons often didn't come from the crash, but from the closing scene, the moment that lingered long after. Through the misted glass, the streetlights glittered like punctuation marks closing out a story, but not ending it. Because the next ride might begin right here. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.